All right, so now we've already gotten our, if we take a look here, we've gotten our sticky nav to stay fixed at the bottom. Now what we need to do is we need to get this header to behave this way, where it goes 100% of the width and the viewport height, and that this little contribute logo stays in the top right and scrolls up along with the header, right? So that's what we need to work on in the next step. And to do that, let's go over to our HTML and see what we need to target. So we've already taken care of this nav, global nav, right? That's the sticky footer that's down here at the bottom, okay? And then the next thing we look at is this main tag. Inside of that is an article, and inside of that is the header. If we open up this header, that is, here, let me collapse these other things. This header is the thing that's got the nav of this particular logo in it. This image, if I select it, you'll see it selects on the page. And this div, right, which if I were to open up this div, you see that the div ends up having the H1 and the byline, the paragraph, right? So, and you see that it's selected over here. All right, so that whole header is what we want to be 100% of the viewport height, all right? And so the other thing that is true, if you take a look at this, is that it is on top of this fixed sticky header in its initial position, all right? So there are two things important to notice about it. One, it's on top of the fixed sticky navigation at the bottom. The other thing is that when I scroll the page, that header scrolls up as well, right? And so that means that it has to be an absolute position, or it has to be a relative position. One of those two things. It has to be one of those two. And so it can't be fixed, because remember, fixed positioning does not scroll. So if I come back over here, and I usually like to try to make something the least complicated as possible. And so if I want to make this as little, with as little complication as possible, then probably what I would want to do is make that header, I would want to make it relative positioning, because relative, if you remember, relative positioning will allow for you to assign a z-index so that it can have a stacking order. So that means it could go on top of that fixed global nav at the bottom. But also relative will scroll with the page. The other thing that relative does is that it doesn't do weird stuff with like the width and so on. Like absolute will do something strange where it won't want to take up 100% of the width. It's, you know, of its natural behavior as a block level element, things like that. If you just leave it as relative though, it still will allow you to do that. So let's go ahead and let's write a rule for the header. And if we look at this, you'll notice that there are no other headers in this page. So if we wanted to just write a rule for header, we could. But if you think that you might ever add other headers in here, then you would need to give this an ID. But I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it as just the header. All right. So down here in the CSS, I'm going to create, here, let's scroll up here. I'm going to create, let's do this so I can move it up, something for header. Okay. And first thing I'm going to do is I'll tell it to have a position like this of relative, right? It's not going to look any different, and that's the whole point of making it relative, is that it doesn't inherently change the behavior of the way that this content is going to look whenever I position it. It'll just change the stacking order. Okay, so now that it is position relative, I can tell it that I want it to be, let's see, width, let's say a height first. We don't need to set the width because it'll automatically go its full width. So height, let's say, is 100 VH for viewport height. All right. And now it's 100 VH. All right. Well, I could also say min height 100 VH, because that could create problems later, potentially, if I just leave it at height. So min height will be both the minimum height, and it will also always go to at least 100 VH. Okay, so the next thing that I would want to do is I want to tell it, now that it's, still behind this fixed sticky menu down here, I want to go ahead and give it a z-index. So we'll say z-index, and we'll make it 900 since the other one was 800. And now what you'll see is that even though it's hard for me to see what's happening, it is on top. And the best way for me to figure out for sure that that's true is I can also go ahead and give this header a background image. So let's do that. Let's say background, and we're going to go ahead and choose the URL, and we're going to go into images. Oops, sorry about that. Let's try that again. URL, and then it will allow us to click on images, and then I am going to choose this one. It's called Color Ravim Noga. All right, so I'm going to choose that, and then it goes ahead and puts it there as the background image. Now the other things that I need to do, remember background is a shorthand property, so I can put a space here and I can say no repeat, for instance, so no dash repeat, like that, and so it won't repeat. The other thing that I can do is I can tell it to be centered. So I'll just say center, and if I only say center, it'll do center vertical and center horizontal, right? The other thing that I might want to do is come back here and I want to say that it's fixed so that it doesn't scroll. So like if I scroll the page now, see that background image does not scroll, right? So that's kind of nice, right? I want it so that the background image does not scroll. If I were to get rid of that though, you'll see that the background image does scroll. And you might like it that way. It's really up to you. I'm going to leave it so that it's fixed. And don't forget to terminate this. The next thing that you want to do is you want to make it so that the background size is set to cover, because right now it's just way too big. So we'll say background, and then you can scroll down and find background size, or you can just type it, and then we're going to say cover, like that. And then now we've got something that is working, right? It's looking right. All right, so you see that it's behaving the way that we wanted it to, in that part's not, of course, but in that if I scroll, you'll see that as I pull this up, it is actually on top of the sticky footer. All right, so that's good. And this is doing something bizarre, and the reason it's doing something bizarre is because we haven't fixed these images. So because those images are really, really big, and so it's scrolling the page side to side to accommodate that. So if you want, what we could do is, let's just go to the very top, and before we do anything else, let's just go ahead and do, right after the body, let's say something for IMG, and we're going to say width 100%. And then that way it won't go any larger than the actual page, and that might make this a little bit more doable. And the reason I'm putting this width 100% up here like that is because I want it to be so that if I have any other image definitions that describe the width, that it'll override whatever came first. If I put this way after, then this image declaration would end up overriding the other stuff. So you want to make sure that you do these general catch-all declarations and rules earlier, and then that you write the more specific ones later, so that they override the general ones. So I could either say width 100, or I could come back here and I could do like width 80%, or maybe even 70%, and then that way they don't take up too much space, so we could do 70%, let's see, 80%, if that looks any better. These cartoons maybe could be 80%. The other thing that I can do too is I can tell it that the images are to behave as block level elements. So you could say, oops, you could say display. That's if you want to, you don't have to. You can say display block, right? That's an option. And then that way, if you do display block and it's set to 80%, you can also say margin like this, and you could say auto. And then that way, it makes the margin automatic so that it will center them, right? Okay, so now we've at least got that as a starting place, which is good. And so now we can see that that's working. The next thing that we want to do is get rid of this red background. We had that there, if you remember, because of the white SVGs, but we don't need that anymore now that we've got this background image here. So let's go up to the body and let's get rid of that where it says background red. And then it'll start to look a little bit more like a regular web page. Okay. All right, so now we've got the basics of this header set up, and in the next video I'm going to talk about how you can get this image to be up here in the top left corner smaller, and how you can get your H1 and your byline to be centered and styled as well.